Thank you, and I'll turn it over to you, Frenchie.
Well, already great. Well, thank you so much for everyone for joining us today. My name is Frances Robles. I'm a correspondent with the New York Times, so I'm a little bit of an outsider here in that I'm not a prestigious author like our guests here. So the title of this session is about short stories. Both of you are short story writers and novelists. So I guess I'm wondering, you know, from a writing perspective, what do you consider yourself? Do you have to be one or the other?
A writer. Seriously, I do just consider myself a writer. I work in so many different genres that I don't think of myself as a novelist or short story writer. Yeah, it just depends on the subject and the form that seems to suggest itself from the material. Yeah.
In my case, I generally write either novels or short stories, but I really came up in the short story form, and it still has a very sentimental place for me as a writer. I still look to short stories as a place to play, to experiment, and I find a lot of freedom in the short story form. And when I'm having challenges with a novel, I might take a little detour into short stories in a way to work out issues that I may be having with a novel. So I don't think I've moved on from short story writing in any way. It will always be something that I carry with me, even as I'm working on a much longer work. So in a way, they're in conversation with another, both forms. And I should say, I do place the same expectations and burdens on a short story that I do place on novels. It's just that I think that a story or an idea will tell you what its architecture needs to be, and some need to live in the form of a story as opposed to the longer landscape of a novel.
And is the writing process the same? I think you told me that you write your short stories in one sitting, or your draft.
I tend to sit with an idea long before I go to the page or to the screen or whatever I'm using to write. So in a way, I've almost experienced the story cinematically in my mind before I've written a single word of it. And in that way, a short story can be written, the first draft, in a single sitting. Not to say the story is done, but I like to harness the energy of a first draft written all in one sitting for a short story. And then I'll, of course, work on it, shaping it and polishing it more. And I try to carry that energy over to novel writing as well, whether it's I'm trying to maybe knock out a few pages on a single sitting, or even a whole chapter. But really, it's a question of how do you harness that energy. In a shorter form, you can maybe sustain it over a draft. And in a novel, of course, that's the great challenge of writing a novel, is harnessing that energy over the long haul.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put. Thank you. I do tend to draft short stories all in one sitting. I think that helps me stay with the unity of mood and tone in the short story. And then I was thinking just this morning about One Brilliant Flame, and how those chapters, I tried to have them work like short stories, with an arc and a kind of epiphany and then some kind of resolution, but then also opening up a question that leads to the next chapter. So that kind of energy is valuable.
Do they ever blur into each other? The thing that you started as a novel ends up being a short story, or vice versa?
You know, not for me so far. That has not happened. It comes into being. It's conceived as one or the other, or an essay or a nonfiction book. It just sort of emerges that way. I don't think I've ever pursued a short story and then had it mushroom. I think it comes relatively formed. Yeah.
I have had a few experiences where what I thought I was writing was not what I was writing. In the case of my first book, which is a novel in stories, or a collection of stories, this one, Vita, right here. So it's called Vita, which is the title story. It's a short story. But that was actually a novel that I was working on. So it was intended to be a novel, and then these other stories that we're writing were my little cheating on my novel project. At a certain point, I had to confront the fact that the novel was not working. And I just put it away and left it alone for a while. And a long time later, it resurrected, or I resurrected it, and in the form of a short story, and I realized that that's what it needed to be all along. And another point, I had written a short story while I was working on other novels, and I wrote it as a short story. I thought it would always be that. It was really born from a single image, from a story that my mother told me once when I was driving with her in Miami. By maybe some of you are familiar with the Rickenbacker Causeway. So my mother told me, just as we were driving, oh, a long time ago, a man threw a baby off this bridge, just like that, you know. She had no information about how or why or what happened or anything about it, but the image of a man throwing a baby off a bridge into the ocean just stayed with me for years while I was working on a novel set in Paris and other things. So I thought maybe I'll write into that space one day. So I wrote a short story, and it took me a long time to get to that story, which was finding the point of entry, who would tell this story, the man, the baby, a bystander, or what, who would have access to what happened, but be able to tell a story about what happened in a meaningful way. And ultimately, a voice came to me, which was the younger sister of the baby who was thrown. So I wrote that story, and it was called The Bridge, and it was published by The Atlantic in 2009 or so. And that story, and I read a lot of stories, that story sat with me much longer than any other story that I've written, maybe because of the way it came to me, you know, through just a throwaway line from my mother. Ultimately, I returned to it, and it became the first chapter of my novel, The Veins of the Ocean. So that is the only time that has happened to me where a story sort of demanded to have a novel life, and it hasn't happened since.
Huh. Now, the title of this session is The Art of the Short Story Collection. So I would love for you guys to talk a little bit about how you approach putting together a collection. Is it thematic? Is it, you know, the best, you know, your greatest hits over the course of a decade? Talk a little bit about that. Either one of you.
Well, my most recent book is a short story collection called The Faraway World. And these are stories that were written over 10 or 12 years, maybe. As I was writing other things, as I said, I published 3 other novels during that period, and at the time, I didn't know how these stories were in conversation with one another. Of course, it's only in hindsight that I realized, and I think as writers, we can look back on our body of work and see that we carry these certain obsessions or preoccupations that resurface and that keep us returning to the page in our explorations as writers. But I wrote a lot of other stories that did not make it into the collection. Ultimately, the 10 that are in there are stories that are all kind of unified in that they are characters who are pulled towards elsewhere, whether it be sentimentally or physically or geographically through immigration or a sense of alienation or isolation. And it's really about how there's a certain longing for elsewheres that follows a lot of people throughout their lives. So those stories are set far and wide. Some are set in Florida, some are set in Cuba, where I did a lot of research when I was writing The Veins of the Ocean. Some are set in Colombia, where my family is from. Some are set in New York, where I'm from as well. But yet all these characters are unified in their sense of compromises they are forced to make in their life, and it had a different title the whole time that I was putting it together. But the title came to me sort of last minute in that I found, my family found a box of photographs that had belonged to my grandfather, who was Austrian, which is why I have a German last name. Sometimes people ask me. And he was a kind of accidental immigrant. He left Austria for a job in Colombia, which was a very faraway world at that time, you can imagine. And before leaving, he took a photograph of the grave of his mother and his grandparents for himself, and he wrote on the back, and he said, "This is goodbye from your beloved son, who is leaving today for the faraway world." And it was written in Old Austrian, which my now Colombian family, none of us speak that, but my father had it translated. And my grandfather never saw his father again because, of course, the war broke out and a lot of things happened, and he lost access to his whole family. But that sense of the faraway world is, I think, something that we all carry that pushes us forward every morning, and everything we do is a sense of moving towards something. So that is really the theme or the feeling, the spirit of the collection. And I think in terms of crafting a short story collection, sometimes the connections are not so literal. It's not place, it's not plot, it's not character, it's not a voice, but it's really just a unifying spirit that is connecting these stories together.
In how Winter Began, the collection of short stories that I have that came out in 2015, the unifying idea is also embodied in the title. How Winter Began explores the origins of violence within relationships, so it's referring to the ancient Greek story of Demeter and Persephone, and how the rupture in that relationship caused by the abduction of Persephone and then her mother's search for her fuels the story of violence and the change of seasons. So How Winter Began is about, every of the stories in Winter Began are all about that issue, how violence can occur in very subtle ways between people, and how that can blossom in a very negative way, a very destructive way. So some of the stories are set in Texas, some are in the Midwest, some are in New York, different places where I've lived or spent a lot of time. I don't think any stories in that collection are set in Florida, but they all have to do with relationships, with gender, with race, with class. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Riverwalk in San Antonio, but the story collection is organized and controlled by a triptych of 3 short stories narrated by a waitress who works on the Riverwalk there.
Is that Irene?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think of her as Irene, but yes, exactly, right. Yeah, and she's named after, the goddess of wisdom, and it's her wisdom that's quite hard-earned through the experience of being exploited, class exploitation, gender exploitation, and then ethnic and racial exploitation as well. So that's sort of the organizing principle. And the central story in the collection, or almost centered, How Winter Began, moves backwards in time and unwinds the story of a Demeter and Persephone story, but set on a college campus with a young Latina who goes to a fraternity party. And so you can imagine kind of where that goes. But I'm very interested in violence and intensity. I'm also interested in concision. So some of the stories are incredibly short. I can't remember. I think there are like 28 stories in that.
I was going to ask you about that. I was struck by how many of your stories were very short.
Yeah.
Is there a sense of when you're done, or when are you comfortable with a story being, I don't know, a certain length?
That's a great question. I don't know. It's so organic. It's a feeling. It's like, it has come to closure, And writing them in one sitting, sometimes I have less time than other times. And so I think about it while I'm working and doing other things. And then when I have, maybe I only have an hour, or maybe I have half an hour, right? So it has to come out really fast. And I've actually written about that and how the length of authors' works reveals things about the material conditions of their lives. I think it's in Brevity online, if anybody is interested in that, and the correspondence or the connections between the luxury of time and the material conditions of our existence, and how those are connected, and how sometimes often our art is shaped by the situations in which we find ourselves, and we have to work with that if we want to keep producing.
Now, not that your stories are long, but you can tell that you're trying to create like a miniature book in them. Or is that a fair characterization?
Yeah. I love, obviously I came to writing as a reader, as I think a lot of writers do. And I love also stories that are like busting at the seams, where you feel like this could also unravel into into a novel, but it's being forced into compression. So I love that. I love that kind of sense of almost explosiveness of a story, but it's being contained. So yeah, I wouldn't say, I guess my stories, and if in terms of length, they're pretty standard, not quite long, not quite short. But I do love the layering and the weight of an intricate world into a short story form. I think it's a lot of fun for me to read and to write.
Now, both of you, your books are similar to me in the thread of Latinas, the thread that Latinas play in your stories. Is that conscious as you're building a collection?
Well, I have never not been Latina. So the space that I occupy in the world is as a Colombian American, and as much as I forget, it's one that people remind me of every day too, when I'm asked, where I'm from and things like that. So I've never experienced this world in any other way apart from my family's heritage, my family's language, even as I move about the world in other spaces. But because I am the child of immigrants and I always grew up around immigrants and in immigrant communities, these are the stories that inspire and fascinate me. So I very often write into a space that centers the experience and worlds of people who are coming from elsewhere, moving towards a different kind of experience, about the family relationships or social relationships that I always think are, just like in life, our relationships are really the stage in which we learn who we are. We don't really know who we are until we have someone else in front of us to also allow us to learn who we are and what we're capable of. And I think that's a wonderful stage to bring into the story form as well. And of course, Latin Americans are the people that excite me, that thrill me, and those experiences are the ones that I carry through my own human experience.
Yeah, I would guess probably in How Winter Began, maybe 70% of the stories have Latina protagonists, and then other stories feature people in different social locations. When I see something happen that provokes me or intrigues me that someone does who's very different from me, I just get really curious about it, and I think, well, what kind of context or what kind of like moral imperatives could make those actions or that utterance make a kind of sense, like a story sense. And then I sometimes write into that, just kind of in a really open, listening kind of way. Some of those stories I end up throwing away, but I worked with a really wonderful editor on this collection, Kristen Elias Rowley. She's the editor-in-chief at Ohio State University Press now. And she was really helpful in thinking about which of these stories do resonate with each other and which don't. And so we saved some for a future collection, which is a project I'm working on now. And then some are just like, they stay in the notebook, right? As with all genres. But in terms of experiencing the world as a Latina in different settings, in different places, that has definitely informed my work a lot.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about that because you actually have an interesting identity backstory. Can you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So when my parents were living in Miami, they were unable to conceive a child. And so they, my grandfather, whom I mentioned the other day, Feliciano Castro, who wrote the book of poems that's coming out in October. He gave them money so that they could adopt a baby. So they talked with a lawyer in Miami and asked for a Cubana baby, or a boy, either one, girl or boy. And a lawyer who was not Latinx or Cuban said, okay, we'll do that, and the baby will definitely be Latino, but we can't guarantee a Cuban baby. And so they were like, okay, whatever. And then when I was born, they picked me up, and I matched well enough to some of the members of the family. And so, they always told me that. It was a closed adoption with no information at all, medical or heritage, nothing. Back in 1967, that's how adoptions were the most frequently done. And so they told me that, you're probably Cuban and you might just be another kind of Latino. And so, growing up, I always, was very curious. I thought maybe I will get to meet my birth mother and birth father one day. And so I was always very open, when, I lived in Texas where in San Antonio, at that point, the greatest majority of other Latinx people were Mexican American. The demographics have shifted a great deal, but still, Mexican American was the majority. And so I was always like, oh, this could be the culture of my mother and my father, and I could meet them one day. And when I was in my 20s, so I had my son when I was 20, and having a child made me even more curious, more profoundly curious. So I registered with it's an international adoption. I don't want to go on too long, but...
You're a white lady.
They matched me up with a woman who had given me up for adoption in Miami, and it turns out that she has no Latinx heritage whatsoever, right? So it was a complete, head trip for quite a while. It was very difficult. She was an educator, and she was a very gentle, kind person. I really liked her, but I felt no connection with her culture in Illinois. I went to meet her in Wisconsin, and her family was from Illinois. Anyway, so no biological roots whatsoever in Latinx culture, and yet until I was 26, that's what everyone in my extended family, including me, believed. So where does identity come from? What is ethnicity? How does it work? Cultural, So it's been a confusing journey, for sure, yeah. So I think adoption is a really extremely interesting experience to have. It sets people on an identity quest that can be very unsettling and very weird. So.
But you do identify as a Latina writer.
I do. Yeah.
When I was reading your stories, both of you, there was a sense, I don't know if reality is the word, whether it was about an eating disorder or marriage falling apart. I felt like the two of you had eating disorders and whose marriages were falling apart. It felt like it was coming from a real place from your heart, which made me wonder what aspects of your characters are informed by your real life or people you know. Or is it all just...
Well, I think that's really the trick of the fiction writers, to make everything feel autobiographical, and that's always what you're going for. But 5 books in, I haven't been writing my autobiography for each book. I get that a lot, even when I write about things like death row inmates and stuff like that, and people are like, is that your brother? And my brother will be in the audience, and he's like, that's not me, that's not me. I don't know if men get the same question, about if what they write is, based on their lives. Like women, some people think for women writing everything is like Dear Diary. And it's not. I actually come to the world of fiction because I'm not interested in writing about myself at all. But I am interested in a human experience, and often a woman's experience. So the things that I explore, whether it be young women's relationships with their bodies, or the interpersonal dynamics a relationship or of a marriage or parenting or being a child. That it's a constant exploration. But again, I love to go outside myself. I'm more inspired by others than I am of my own experience, and I also enjoy the privacy of my own life. But again, I think that for as a reader, you come to reading for what feels like an authentic experience, even though you know that it's art. And it's invented, and it's creation, and that's what's so thrilling about it. So in a way, as a writer, the highest compliment I can receive is for somebody to think that that voice coming through you on the page is me, and not the person who sat down to write it that day. But of course, that person could not exist without me. Right, so it's almost like a relationship I have with the characters, but I do give my characters full autonomy to tell me who they need to be without me being a dictator or even trying to shelter them from their own experiences, and certainly without the tyranny of trying to push my own agenda on them, because that's not why I come to reading, right? I don't know about you, but I know that when I come to read, I don't like to feel like the author's telling me what to think or feel, right? I like to make my own decisions, and that's what I hope for as a writer.
Yeah, so I write and publish memoir and creative nonfiction, personal essays as well as fiction. And I also write like film scholarship and literary scholarship. And in all those things, there is a kind of unifying vision or a way of looking at the world, a way of being in the world. But, you know, readers who are genuinely interested in knowing if my marriages have fallen apart, marriages plural, or if I had an eating disorder, like, they can look that right up. Those are in my books. But I keep the line between fiction and nonfiction really clean. I know that some writers of nonfiction experiment with inventing things in the nonfiction. But for me, I feel like there's a little bit of a social contract with the reader, and if you're reading something that says memoir or something that says personal essay, then nothing in that has been invented. Certainly shaped, right? But very very open-handed and self-disclosing about what's being, you know, artistically shaped. But no content is invented. Whereas a short story is an open field for free play and can go in all kinds of directions. And an experience that I might have indeed had can move in all different kinds of fashions and be refashioned and be, you know, embroidered or have elements that are invented. So I think working with both, you can use material again and again and again because you come at it in different ways and it can feel fresh, strange, like defamiliarized. So it can work in different genres, but I do keep that faithful contract with the reader.
Someone from the audience asked this morning, what short story collections do you recommend? I'm curious to know which ones you reread as well.
Can I just quickly recommend The Faraway World? Like crazy. It's so fantastic, and I was teaching from it last fall. It's a gorgeous collection. Everything that Patricia has said about it, so true and much
Coming out in
more.
paperback soon.
Yeah, it's coming out paperback on Tuesday.
So brilliant.
Or next, yeah.
Yeah, I really love that. I love Catherine Mansfield's short stories. They were very formative for me as a young reader. And then I often teach The House on Mango Street as both a collection of short stories and a novel. So we read individual by Sandra Cisneros. That was very formative for me as a young writer. So those are two that I go back to when I think about craft and shape. I just admire both writers so much.
Yeah, there's wonderful. Thank you, Joy, for your kind words. I'm always, when everyone asks me for a book recommendation, I'm instantly stumped, and I have to keep lists of everything I write. But like Joy, I teach. So some books that I teach because I think they're so wonderful. I love the short stories by Michael Cunningham. He's an incredible short story writer. Or Dennis Johnson, Jesus' Son, is an old favorite. Lori Moore's short stories. Mary Gateskill was an early favorite of mine. There are even authors who are here, like Dantiel Muniz, her book, Milk Bullet Heat, is wonderful. Jonathan Escoffery's work, Janine Capo-Cruzet's How to Leave Hialeah is a wonderful Florida book. Lauren Groff, her stories. Karen Russell. I mean, so many of them you've seen here the past couple of days. They're all incredible.
What do you think of the sort of the movement towards having short stories be very interconnected, the way Jonathan's stories are?
What do I think about it?
Yeah.
I don't know if I would call it a movement. I think it's something that's been with us, as a creative exploration for some time. But I think that maybe what appeals to readers, because in my first book, Vita, there's a single protagonist that a reader's followed through 9 short stories, and I think what appeals then is that you can stay longer with the characters. You don't have to move on with them as quickly. You can see them at different moments in their lives, and it allows for a sense of continuity, but also movement, right, and progression. And allows you to sit in the resonance, the emotional resonance of a collection of stories a bit longer. So, as a reader, I love reading those too because I develop deep attachments to characters that I like.
How about you?
About the same, yeah.
This session ends at 2:15, so we can do questions or not. So if folks want to give me a signal of whether they want to go to questions, I'm happy to give our audience an opportunity to. I see somebody in the back. I don't know who has the mics.
If you have a question, please stand and we will bring the mic to you.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed your presentations very much. But as I am aging, literally and figuratively, I'm finding I'm listening to books more, whether it be short stories, whether it be novels. When you write, do you aim at a specific genre of the audiobook or the printed page? And how do you address the fact that an oral presentation might be completely different from your story on paper?
What a great question. I wish I had asked that.
It is a great question. When I revise, I do read everything aloud multiple times for the sonic effects to really hear how it's going to sound in the mind of the reader. It's not that I'm writing for an audio book, but I think when we read something on the page, we have an internalized, voice going on, and it really matters to me. The rhythm, the poetry of the language on the page is incredibly important to me in all genres. So I do write with that in mind, absolutely. I myself don't listen to too many audiobooks. I listen to podcasts, but not when it's literature. I love to read it on the page and to hear my own imagined version of that voice. Like I love that so much that sometimes when I go to the audiobook, even when it's read by the author, I'm like, oh no, that's not the voice. I want the voice that my brain creates. So.
In my case, I also have come more to audiobooks in recent years, in terms of the writing process, of course, it's like Joyce said, I hear my voice as well. For one of my books, for The Veins of the Ocean, I did the audiobook myself. So, of course, I was able to control what you're discussing, allowing what I intended for the story to come through in the voice as best as I could do it, because, of course, I'm not a professional narrator. And there are professionals who do it so well. So in terms of how the sausage is made a little bit for audiobooks, publishers generally, audition readers for it. And in the case of my most recent books,
Did you have to audition?
No, I didn't for The Veins of the Ocean, but for Infinite Country, which is my most recent novel, and The Faraway World, the readers, audition. They send samples, and we had conversations about it. And many times they asked me, when they were reading the material, and they came to me and asked me, if what they were reading and intending matched with what I had intended, and so in that case, I could feel very happy with what they came to. But I think it's also similar to translation, which is its own art form, right? There is a point when, as a writer, you write the book, and then the book belongs to readers, and it belongs to others. And there are people like translators who do their work so well, and at times you can have a dialogue with them and work together on a translation that is even stronger. But there are times when that you can trust them to know what they're doing with the work as well.
I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I find that, especially in the universe that you two occupy, so many of the readers don't speak Spanish, and then they trip up, the pronunciation of words, and I find that very distracting. So it was a real treat to listen to your book and have you, it's like you reading it the way it was intended to be heard. Are you working on anything now?
One of the things I really loved about One Brilliant Flame is that they did hire 6 actors to do all the different voices, and they all did speak Spanish beautifully and have wonderful accents. And so listening to that book on the Audible version is like listening to one of those wonderful old-fashioned radio plays. It's just great. That's my favorite of my books that's been an Audible book. The other ones, I'm sort of like, that doesn't sound like NOLA to me for the New Orleans novels, or in Flight Risk. That doesn't sound like Isabel sounds in my own mind. But One Brilliant Flame, they did it really right. So I loved that, yeah.
There was a gentleman in the back who had a question. Is he still standing, or should I keep going?
We're going to go here, and then we'll move over there.
Okay.
Sorry. So from a craft perspective, what do you think of as the difference between creating the endings, the finale of a short story versus a novel?
For me, it's quite similar. I never have a literal picture of how a story or a novel will end. More often than not, it's an emotional note that I would like to land on, and then I have to figure out how I'm going to get there. So often, I don't even know that I'm at the end of a story or a book until I stumble upon that moment, that emotional note, and then I can feel it sort of intuitively that this is where we end. But it's not as literal or as concrete as a scene or a line or a moment or a plot point. It's really a feeling that I intend for the story or the piece to conclude upon.
Sometimes when I'm writing a short story, I do get almost like a gift the final image, the visual image, or the final line. It just happens, and I start writing towards that, and it's the journey to get there that is the mystery and the strangeness. Like, how do I earn that final image that's been given as a mental gift to me? How do I get there? And then with novels, for me, it's a little bit more organized than that. I might know what the final, what the resolution would be to the plot, but sometimes I don't know that at all, and I'm really, writing in the dark the whole way, looking for it. When does the closure feel organic and authentic? Yeah.
There you go.
This is our last question.
I enjoyed your talk very much. I have a two-part. Does this go out? Okay.
Keep going.
I have a two-part question. Do you write in Spanish? I assume that you do, but do you think in English and it's translated in Spanish, or I assume that you're a native Spanish speaker, so how does that work? And the second part of the question is, I ask this question to everybody I know that's bilingual. I've struggled with learning other languages and have a hard time with it. And I noticed that many people who look like me, what's the word for that, gringo? Or is there, gringo is an insult, isn't it? Or is there another native speaker?
I don't think it's an insult. I think it's just a description, like Yankee.
Yankee, okay. Oh, I can take Yankee. I'm from New York. Some places, Yankee is an insult. Why do we have such a terrible time learning foreign languages when somebody that worked in the fields in Mexico and doesn't have an education can come across the border and work here for 6 months and he's fluent? Do you have a theory for that? I've heard several theories. One friend of mine who's Cuban said, like it was not even an argument, English is much easier to learn. And that shocked me.
Do you write in Spanish? Either of you?
I do. My fiction is, most of my education was in English, and I actually majored in French literature, so it would be in English and French. But and so my books are all written in English, but I do write in Spanish. So sometimes I'm asked to write essays and things like that in Spanish for Latin American publications and things like that. But I have worked heavily with my Spanish language translators, again, because they're translating something from English into Spanish, even though it maybe comes from largely a Spanish sensibility, right? Which it makes it for an interesting translation process. But it's an interesting thing to. My first language was Spanish, and probably my emotional life exists largely with a Spanish language orientation, cultural orientation. But the language of my intellectual expression is English, and it's interesting how those things come through. And there are a lot of writers like me who write from the same place, where their emotional life, their family life exists in the Spanish language, but they're expressing it in English, and how those idioms and things like that then come through in English is part of the fun of it as well. In terms of accessibility for monolingual people and maybe challenges of learning a language, I don't know. I mean, you go to Europe and you see 3-year-olds speaking 5 languages, so I have no answers for you in terms of that. But of course, that's something for each person to explore unto themselves. The exciting thing for me about working with language and 3 languages that I speak is the intersections. One thing that my grandmother used to say about a cousin of mine who didn't speak Spanish, was that it made her sad in that she thought that there were things about himself that he would not be able to understand, because there are things that can be expressed in one language that don't exist in another. There are things that can be expressed in Spanish to describe the human experience that simply do not translate to English. But that's not to say those of us who speak English don't feel those things, but we don't have the language for it, even though another language does. So in that way, I think the more languages you know, the more language you have to describe your interior life.
Well, thank you so much. We're actually at time. I want to thank particularly the members of the Key West community who have come to join us. And both their books are on sale in the book selling tent right there. Thank you.
Thank you.